welcome everyone to our next GDS tutorial. I have a few announcements before I hand it over to today's speaker. If you want to give us feedback on how these tutorials are going, especially if you have attended more than one of them, please scan the QR code on the left side of the screen. Tell us if we're doing anything well that you think we should keep doing, or tell us if we need to change anything. If you haven't already scanned the QR code in the middle, that will take you to the GitHub repo for this entire tutorial series. The material you need for today is in the folder that starts with today's date. Finally, if you're not already a GDS member, but you're getting value out of these tutorials, please consider joining GDS using the QR code on the right. If you are already an APS member, then joining GDS is the same as joining any other unit, so there's an additional $10 charge on your registration. But from that charge, you will get access to all of our resources from GDS, including our mailing list about events and job postings and things like that. Finally, if you or someone you know would be interested in giving one of these tutorials on data science or machine learning or artificial intelligence, please have them email me at the email address at the top of the screen. Even if it's just like a topic you want to see in the future, we can also try to find a speaker for any topics you're interested in. The next tutorial will be in 2 weeks, so July 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern, and it'll be on decision making and automated experiments. And so if you're interested in automating your experiments with machine learning or just Bayesian optimization or reinforcement learning, which tend to be topics which aren't used a lot in traditional machine learning, then this would be a good talk to come to. And the registration link should be posted on our website. If you've missed any of the previous tutorials and want to watch recordings, we have all of the recordings collated on a playlist on the APS YouTube channel, which you can access through this QR code. Some of our prior tutorials have been on physics-informed neural networks and unsupervised machine learning. So lots of very popular topics, and the tutorials will give you a background that you need to get started with those topics. The code for all of the previous tutorials is in the same GitHub repo we'll be using today, and it's also linked in the video description of each of the videos. Finally, GDS is launching a new feature where we want to highlight on our website and also on our social medias interesting data science research that's being done. Since we as the group on data science span a wide variety of physics disciplines, we want to create an avenue to share interesting data science workflows across the different physics disciplines. And so especially if you're a graduate student or a postdoc or an early career member, and you've recently published a paper that you think has an interesting workflow in it, please scan this QR code and submit the form, and we would be happy to share it with our community. And so with that, I will stop sharing. I will be posting the GitHub link in the chat momentarily, but I'll turn it over to our speaker.
Thank you, Julie. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Hi, everyone. First, thanks, Julie and GDS for having me give this tutorial. My name is Abhishek. I'm a graduate student at the University of Rochester, and I work on theory for superconducting qubits primarily. Today, I want to talk about how we can enable reproducible science research workflows using modern Python tooling. So in the past, I've struggled with having code that I've written before, like several months ago, and then reproducing the results several months in the future. And that's kind of the problem I want to address during today's seminar or tutorial. So like Julie mentioned, all the code for this is already up on the GitHub. You can go to the folder with today's date and look at the README for that, which includes links to the various tutorial files. And I encourage you to follow along locally on your computer if possible. That will sort of give you the largest shock and awe value of what we're going to talk about today. However, if you do not want to, most of these can also be accessed just through your browser without installing anything. So to start, maybe let's let me talk about sort of the elephant in the room when everybody uses Jupyter for their research or their data science. That Jupyter notebooks, while they are still a fantastic tool, and they enable this whole new scientific workflow where you can have literate programming notebooks where you write your thoughts in addition to the code that you use to implement those thoughts and whatever procedures you're doing. However, uh, over the years since Jupyter was developed, we've discovered that there are a lot of common headaches with this kind of approach that Jupyter took. And some of these headaches have sort of managed to become common experience in the community. So I want to list a few of them right now. So have you ever encountered this in a Jupyter notebook where you've run a cell, initializing a variable, added something to it, and then you've executed that cell twice, indicated by this 3 on the number here. And then when you print out the variable, it has a certain value. Now, just simply reading this code does not explain to you, if I hide sort of the labels on the left, does not explain to you why the output of the cell is 2. Uh, Similarly, you could have deleted or edited a cell in between. So despite the fact that in this middle column here, despite the fact that, like the previous column, if you had executed them all in order and only then changed this value 1 to 2, the notebook still does not match the state of the output. Or you could have the other case where, you're moving code around in the notebook and you've deleted a cell, or you've cut a cell somewhere and you've pasted it somewhere else, but you forgot to paste it somewhere. Or maybe you deleted it and then went somewhere and forgot that you actually did. The next time you run the notebook, it will not reproduce this. You will get some kind of an error. In fact, several people did a study on this back in 2019, and they saw that, in fact, a majority of the Jupyter notebooks that exist on GitHub are not reproducible, and some of them won't even execute all the way through. Another issue that you might be familiar with is that when you try to use Git as version control for these kind of notebooks, we encounter this error, this kind of situation where the notebook files, because they're encoded as JSON, just blow up in size. In fact, if you have plot outputs in your notebook, they kind of look like this when you upload them to GitHub, because these images are base64 encoded, and therefore, if you change the output, even if it's just slightly different by 1 pixel, the base 64 encoding of that image will be very different, and so you'll get a very large diff in your Git repository that essentially does not convey any information. This is not human readable, and that's one of the other concerns I have with Jupyter notebooks, in that it is very hard to separate the part that is your code from all the rest of the notebook. So my personal approach has been for several years that whenever I think about sharing a Jupyter notebook or reporting results from a Jupyter notebook or simply committing them to version control, I will go up to the top in the toolbar and click on this kernel and do a restart and run all. And that tells me that, yes, all these cells have executed all the way through. They've executed only once. And if there's an error, I'll catch it. So this has gone a long way in ensuring that Jupyter notebooks can be reproducible, but this is extra cognitive overhead on the part of the scientist that you have to remember each time to do, otherwise you risk breaking your code. So enter Marimo, a new reactive Python notebook. Now, disclaimer, I'm not involved in the development of Marimo. I'm simply a user who's been very happy with how this has taken away some of the problems that Jupyter has. In fact, this is a direct blurb from the README on GitHub, which we'll go through a little bit, and then I'll show you some of these features in detail. But the whole motivation behind Marimo was to address some of these problems that Jupyter had. Importantly, it replaces a whole set of tooling that had been created sort of around the ideas that Jupyter initially started with, including this notion of Jupyter widgets or IPy widgets. The main thing about Marimo that makes it reproducible is that it is a reactive notebook, meaning whenever you change a cell, all dependent cells automatically get updated. Or you can optionally mark them as stale so that you don't incur a huge performance overload in cases when you're running very expensive functions. Like I mentioned about IPy widgets, Marimo includes as a submodule interactive widgets that work out of the box in Marimo notebooks. You can have different kinds of interactive inputs, and we'll see some of them in the following example. Also, to get rid of the JSON problem that Jupyter has, Marimo notebooks are stored as IPython files, as .py scripts. And that, even though they don't look like regular Python scripts that you would be used to writing, there is a very clear indication of what parts are your code and what parts aren't. Also, instead of storing it as a Python script, you do have the option to export it as a Markdown file, where it is compatible with the Quarto publishing system if you were familiar with that. Another great feature is that natively Marimo supports SQL, data frames, and just database ecosystems overall. This was one of the features that was targeted the most for this kind of notebook because it's targeted at data science people. And also, Marimo integrates a whole bunch of AI features like integrating with various LLMs, if provided you have API keys and all that sort of thing. Today, we won't be going into any of the AI stuff, but I encourage you to look at the docs for the details on that. Importantly, this whole notion of reactivity ensures that you have no hidden state in your notebooks, meaning you will not run into the error where your code says one thing and the output say a different thing. We'll talk about the shareability in a little bit, and you'll get to experience this yourself if you choose to follow along. And the rest of it, while important, Marimo has some of these other features like being able to reuse functions from other Marimo notebooks or writing PyTest functions straight into the notebook so that whenever you update a cell, it runs the test. These are all very nice features, but we will not go into any of them today. So what are some of this is the interface you're looking at right now is the Marimo notebook. How I got here is I'm going to switch to my terminal for a second and recreate this process. So if you want to follow along, once you've cloned the repository for these tutorials and you've gone into the folder that corresponds to today's tutorial, you can see that there's a few Python scripts in here and a README and a folder with some assets of images. To start using Marimo, what you need to do is first install the UV package manager. And the reason we're talking about UV is recently developed Python package management tool that makes everything so much faster that it enables entirely new workflows. I'll get to what I mean by that specifically in a second. But here's just a graphic from UV's website showing just how much faster UV is compared to other popular tools like Poetry, PDM, and PipSync. UV can be used as a replacement for any kind of Python workflow that involves only PyPI packages, so not Conda packages. There are other tools for that, but today we'll be focusing on only UV. The part that we are really interested in is the fact that you can run scripts with supported inline dependency metadata. And what that means is that you can specify in a Python script what the dependencies of that script are. Therefore, this does away with the whole notion of requiring a requirements.txt file and then having to pip install it and having to create a VM or a virtual environment for yourself. UV automates all of that process. So to install UV, I encourage you to go to this website, and then if you are comfortable, copy one of these links, pop it into your terminal, and install it. Once you're done with that, we will install Marimo as a tool. To do this, you paste into your terminal this command uv tool install Marimo, and then it will install it for you. Now, I have all this installed in my system, so I'm not going to do it for you. But hopefully, if you're following along, you'll already have experienced installation times that you're not used to for Python. So going back to the repository, now that you have UV and Marimo installed, no. So I'm looking at the question in the chat, and the question says, does it require sudo to install UV? It does not. So UV this is why I really like all these Rust kind of tooling that's coming out now. UV basically just downloads the executable as a binary, and you can put it on whatever path you want, and you can just run that directly. Of course, I encourage you for security reasons to inspect the actual shell script that you're running, but it is very, very convenient and very, very fast. So if you've installed UV in your environment, then the command you will be running is the next one on the GitHub, which is similar to you. So here there's a placeholder, and I will tell you what to do with that. But the command you'll be running is uvx marimo edit with this sandbox. This is quite similar to how you would start a Jupyter notebook, right? When you would do a Jupyter notebook, you would just type Jupyter notebook or Jupyter lab, and it would start up, except you'd have to install Jupyter in some form. You could do that with UV tools, but that's exactly what we're doing here with this UVX command. UVX tells UV to run the tool called Marimo, and then edit will start an edit server, which is the equivalent of starting Jupyter Lab. Now, the interesting part here is the sandbox option, which tells Marimo that it is supposed to handle all the dependencies in a sandboxed manner. So it will handle all the virtual environment creations, all the dependency installation stuff for you. And that's kind of what we want for these kind of reproducible workflows that we're trying to work with. So back in the terminal, I encourage you to type in this command, which would be uv marimo edit sandbox, and then the name of the first notebook if you want. This would be the same for the other notebook that's in this repository as well. But since we were looking at the first one, that's all it took to install whatever Marimo was in there, what dependency was in there, which was mostly Marimo for this notebook. And it runs the notebook in your browser, just like that. It is super fast. So coming down to more of the IDE features. Like I mentioned, this interface is Marimo itself. And so you can see on the left-hand side, you have these set of, I'm going to call them toolbars, which essentially mimic the usual functionality of some IDEs. You can have access to various files. There's a variable explorer, which lets you look at whatever the variables you've defined are, global mostly. There is a data sources panel that we'll get to in a future notebook. There's an dependencies panel, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But like we mentioned, there's a package manager inside of Marimo. And you'll see that here it says that you're running this inside a sandbox. In fact, you can get a list of all the packages installed, and these are all just related to whatever Marimo is doing. You have the usual outline explorer for this, and there is a chat with AI feature where if you have API keys for OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, or AWS stuff, you could put them here and then talk to your favorite LLM right inside the Marimo notebook and code with your AI assistant. Now, one of the features that I really like about Marimo is this panel over here, where it lets you lets you view documentation just as you type. So if I were to type, let's see, so I've imported, if you notice, I've imported Marimo as MO over at the top. And so MO is now, as we saw in the variable panel, populated with the module Marimo. So let me try to see what kind of stuff Marimo has, and maybe to give you a little bit of preview into what we're going to see in a bit. I'm looking at this function from this Marimo library, and you see that the documentation is populated on the left side. And this is rendered very nicely in rich fashion so that you can look at all the options, what the data types are, and get a description for what these things are, what the returns are, what the errors it could raise are. And Marimo handles all of this for you for whatever packages are installed on your system. There's also notebook logs, which give you the outputs on standard out and standard error channels. There is very basic profiling for your notebook, so you can see that if your notebook has a certain number of cells, each of their runtime is timed, and it shows up next to the cell once it's run, like over here, 7 milliseconds, and you can kind of see that's over here. And it'll give you this sort of a graph telling you in how the cells have executed. There's a panel including a list of some snippets that are commonly used, and Marimo has support to manage environment variables for you. So you do not have to hard code secrets into your notebook anymore. You can just add them in here at the top. There's also a small scratchpad where you can do things and it'll run it in the Python interpreter, and you'll get the output at the bottom of that here. And finally, there's also a terminal which opens in the folder where your repository is. Now, before we move on, two things. First, I told you that all of the cells in this notebook ran, and they ran on their own. But how did that happen? So coming back to this dependencies tab, uh, it's a little hard to see here, but if I go to this mini map thing, it'll show me all the cells, and you can see that the cells are numbered. And then if I go to this thing where it says vertical tree, and I zoom in right here, you can see that there are two cells that seem to have an arrow between them. And we'll see this in a little more detail in the future notebooks, but this is how Marimo enables you to have reactive and reproducible workflows. Once you write your notebook, Marimo creates this directed acyclic graph of dependencies between cells. And therefore, it knows which cells to update when you update any given cell in your notebook. You can see also here that there are other cells which are unrelated or unconnected to other things, and that's just because they won't update if you change anything over here. Another short note is the format in which Marimo stores these notebooks, like I said, is a Python script, but it might not be a Python script like you're used to seeing. First, you'll notice that there's some metadata here, and this is kind of how UV and Marimo together install all these packages and create these reproducible environments. It imports Marimo and has something called an app. And then if you've ever written something with Fast API or Flask, this will look a little familiar to you. This kind of looks like routes for a web app. And in fact, that's how Marimo stores your notebooks, as a web app, if you choose to store it as a Python script. I'll show you in a minute what it looks like as a markdown file, but this is kind of how Marimo stores your code and knows how to reference them in other cells. For instance, if we go here, you'll see that there's a cell here, which we'll get to in a minute, or we're looking at on the side here, where it returns a value called apple. And there's another cell where this function takes apple as an argument to that function. And that's kind of how Marimo creates this little DAG that we saw earlier, where it knows that since this cell defines an apple and the following cell depends on this apple, that's how we should run that cell. Okay, so after we've done all this, we see that I've defined a variable called an apple. And now because Python supports emojis and Unicode and all that good stuff, I've put a different fruit that also has apple in the name. However, it is not really an apple. You can see that below, this is a markdown cell, which is written completely in Markdown, except for this part, which looks like a Python F string, if you've ever used that. So what Marimo can let you do is take a Python variable that you've defined in your notebook and interpolate that into a Markdown string. In fact, that's just the the tip of the iceberg for all this kind of mixing and matching of different kinds of outputs that Marimo can do. But it has this very nice integrated Markdown editor where if I look at if I click on this little Python icon over here, it shows you what the Python code for that Markdown cell is. So unlike Jupyter, every single cell in Marimo is actually a Python cell. It just has this function called Markdown, which renders an F string with the interpolated value of Apple. But we also have a nice little Markdown editor, which makes everything nice. So we see that I'm here interpolating the value of Apple from this variable that I've set over here. But I've left myself a comment saying, oh, that doesn't look like the right fruit, so let's go ahead and change it. So now that I've pasted the correct form into this variable, you'll see that the cell is colored yellow, and this button over here is also lit up compared to all the other cells where it's just plain. That is Marimo marking a cell as stale, telling you that this cell has not been run. And so I can hit that button and it'll run that and this next cell, which depended on it, and you'll see that the apple naturally appears. And so that is kind of a, a snapshot of how reactivity works in Marimo. But we're all interested in kind of using this for scientific workflows. And to do that, I encourage you to open the second notebook in this tutorial. You can do that locally by doing the same thing we did earlier, by doing UVX Marimo edit sandbox, and then the name of this 02 simple pendulum.py. But because we want this to be reproducible, I've gone ahead and done a thing where you can just click this link and it'll open up the same notebook in your browser. So let me tell you a little bit about what's happening here. Even though this notebook appears like it's coming from the cloud, this marimo.app is just a hosting service that the Marimo team provides. In fact, this notebook is running locally on your browser right now. And in fact, it's running locally on my browser. And this is enabled by the fact that now there is a Python runtime that runs in your browser using a technology that's called WebAssembly, or WASM for short. So there are a large subset of commonly used Python packages that you can just use like this without ever installing anything on your system at all. And that's kind of goes a long way in ensuring reproducibility. If it not only runs on your machine, but runs in any browser, I think that's a bigger guarantee than, oh, it runs in my virtual environment that I set up 5 months ago or something like that. So here is an example that I wrote a while ago to showcase how, in very simple scientific settings, you might use Marimo to create an interactive example. Note that we have, as with Jupyter, you will have a cell where we have imported a whole bunch of dependencies that we would commonly use. For this example, I'm going to showcase solving the equations of motion for a simple pendulum. And just for fun, I've also here taken the value of small g for all the planets in the solar system and put them in a dictionary. So that we can look at how pendulums would behave all across the solar system. Now, coming to the interactivity part of Marimo, you'll see that these things look similar to Jupyter widgets if you've ever used them. However, they're more streamlined and sleek looking. Personally, I like the look of this much better. And they're also significantly simpler to use than Jupyter widgets, in my opinion. So the way we created the slider here for pendulum length is by using that function that I kind of showed you earlier called mo.ui.slider. In fact, if you go to the Marimo documentation, you'll see that there's a whole zoo of different inputs that you can use. And in fact, you can create your own with technology that we'll talk about in a little bit. But so this is, it's very easy to read in terms of where my slider will start, what the last value could be, how evenly the values are spaced, what is the default value here, a label so that I know what I'm changing, and the show value just shows me what the current value of the slider is. Similarly, there's a number field which creates this kind of number which goes up or down. Um, and there's a radio button field which I've used this dictionary to populate the various options. And Marimo provides this nice VStack option to stack them all vertically in this nice UI kind of environment. And when I click away, you'll see that the code for this goes away because there's a hide code option, which lets me show this real nicely. So how do we implement interactivity into our code? It's as simple as using the dot value attribute for these inputs. And so I'm picking the current G just by looking at whatever simulation planet I've selected and getting the dot value attribute. And then I've defined a function that has the equations of motion, and it can defines the equations of motion. And then in the following cell, I set the initial angle, set the initial angular velocity, create the time span that will be used to run the simulation, where again, I populate the endpoint using a value from this input above. Then I'm using SciPy solve initial value problem function on the function I defined previously with all the information I gave earlier, and added in as a parameter to this function the length of the pendulum that I set up from this input. And that should be enough to solve my equations of motion. And in fact, it is. So here I can plot, as I would usually, the results of the simulation. You can see that the pendulum does indeed have sinusoidal looking oscillation, and the angular velocity does vary in a way that also seems reasonable. And all of this ran when I started the notebook, but I do have also the option to disable that by clicking on this option down here, where it now goes from auto run to lazy, meaning when I start up this notebook, it will no longer start it up and run everything together. In case you have a notebook that takes a lot of time to run. So there's another very cool thing about Marimo, which if you use things like Streamlit to make web apps or dashboards or something like Dash from Plotly, Marimo has what's called a toggle app view, which lets you hide all the code and just keep the markdown and outputs. And so in this case, we can now showcase the kind of interactivity Marimo has, where if I change the value of the slider, automatically the code running the differential equation solver gets executed, and then the plotting code gets executed after that. Let's try to see how this pendulum would look like on the planet Jupiter, perhaps. We know Jupiter has much stronger gravity than Earth, and so we would expect the pendulum to oscillate faster. What about Neptune? Well, we can see that Neptune is significantly lighter than Jupiter, and so, the period extends. And the other thing that you might notice is it's easier to see in the app mode, but as I'm turning the slider very, very slowly, the plot kind of updates on its own, right? This is sometimes undesirable if you have code that's very expensive to run. And so some of these Marimo inputs also have a option called debounce, which if you're familiar with buttons and such, it will not update the code until I let go of the slider. And so that, in a nutshell, is a demo for how interactivity and reactivity in Marimo works. But remember this dependencies panel that we took a look at earlier? Now that we have some interesting scientific code to look at, this looks a lot more vibrant and connected than it was before. And so let's take a look at what's going on here. We can zoom right in and see that the cell that doesn't depend on anything else is the G values for all these things. There's an arrow to the input slide, because that input slide uses the values of that dictionary to populate the planet picker. There's also all the imports that go into the pendulum solving code. all of those things go into the cell that's actually calling the solve IVP function. And finally, that plus some of these other things like the imports to matplotlib go into this cell over here that does all the plot. You can also view it as a horizontal tree if that is more your preference. And there are all these other cool options that will let you highlight the current cell in this tree and other such cool features. Now, while I do like this plot that I've made, it's not really styled appropriately for a talk. Uh, Matplotlib's great, but I really like Seaborn because it includes some of these defaults. And so let's try doing that. I'm going to import Seaborn in this notebook, again, running in my browser. So you'll notice that it says no package called Seaborn, and then it installed a package called Seaborn for it. And now this imported cell works just fine. And the reason it could do that is because, again, we are running Marimo in the browser, and it's running it with its internal package management setup. If you're running this if you're running this locally, you will notice a pop-up that asks you to install it, and it'll have an option called UV. It'll tell you that UV is the thing that's managing it, and it should be just as fast. So notice how quick it was for Seaborn to install, and that kind of thing is enabled by this really robust package management system that Marimo has. So now that we've installed Seaborn, let's go ahead and change this plot a little. So I'm gonna go to the next line and then use some context managers. If you're not familiar with Seaborn, I encourage you to look it up because it is it's a wrapper around Matplotlib for the most part, but there's a lot of good defaults. And so since this is a talk, I want to use the plotting context that is talk, and the effect of that will be to make the labels a lot bigger so that everybody can see things clearly. So that's just how easy it is to iterate over some of these things in Marimo notebooks. And now that, of course, it's in the cloud, so it won't save, but if you're doing this locally, the entire state of the notebook is valid at any time when the notebook is saved. So moving on to the last example that we're going to consider today, also in this GitHub repository here, there's a link to the notebook that will open it up in your browser. But this is one of the examples that I've chosen from the Marimo examples repository. And there are many more over there. So over there, as well as the Marimo repository itself under the examples folder. So please feel free to go and look at that. There's a question in the chat about, do you always have to run in the browser, or is there a command line option to run available? Thanks for that question, because indeed there is a way to execute Marimo notebooks completely in the command line, and the way to do that is to use Marimo run. So for this case, I'm going to refer to the documentation to show you the place where this is mentioned. But you can execute a notebook with Python and it will just run it like a regular script. If you don't have any interactive elements that you need to be using, if it's just a standard workflow that you're executing, you don't even have to open the browser if you run it like this. So yeah, you can just run it off the command line and not off the browser. There's also other sort of, you can run it in VS Code, but there's an example, there's a extension for VS Code stuff. There's all cool kinds of stuff going on with Marimo. This is really the next generation Python notebook. Right, so coming back to our third example, we're going to look at embeddings of the MNIST database. So the MNIST dataset. So first, I'm going to show you what this notebook looks like as just the web app or the dashboard, and then we'll dive a little bit into the code. So here, if you're if you're not familiar with MNIST, it's a data set of handwritten digits. And this is just visualizing the principal component analysis of that in 2 dimensions. So we're plotting different clusters corresponding to different digits. Now, I can, because this is an interactive notebook, I can select some part of this data and it will give me a preview of all the data points I selected and then give me a little table here that shows me which of these data points I've picked, where they are on the X and Y axes, and what digit they correspond to. I can select some of these to examine them further, or I can select them all to see everything, which is also equivalent to selecting none of them. So before we sort of explore this example in more detail, let's take a little look at how this is happening under the hood. So this is a pretty standard workflow. We're using scikit-learn and we're loading the MNIST database dataset that's already present in the library. We're doing a PCA decomposition and we're fitting the raw digits that we got from this dataset. And then we are creating a pandas data frame with this data that we got from the fit. Now, remember I told you that Marimo has really good support for data frames? Let's go ahead and make a new cell here and then look at this variable embedded. So it'll usually take a couple of, because this is running in the cloud, it'll take a second, but you see that this very rich data frame viewer just appeared for the data frame that we're looking at. And before we get there, you can search parts of your data from your data frame. This is very useful if you have text data. You can click this little icon over here or that icon over there to open up this one over the third one, which is called a row viewer, opens up this individual row. And so you can, as we're clicking on different rows, you'll see that the data populates, and you can also do that over here, go to the ends. We can also look at the column explorer on the last button over here, which shows me a summary of all these columns. And so I can look at sort of a summary of the column X, and you can see that it plots a little histogram, and it gives me some statistics on these things. This is very convenient if you're doing kind of exploratory data analysis, and you can also pin this to the side so that, as you change data frames or anything like that, you have a live updated view of what's going on. Interestingly, you'll see that there's this other icon over here called the chart builder, which I find really cool because you'll notice that there's the table tab, but you also have this plus button over here, which is an interactive chart creator. And so this uses not matplotlib, but a different library called Altair and Altair Vega to create these very cool interactive plots. And so, for example, if for our data set, we want to recreate that embedding plot that we just saw, I would pick the x-axis to be the x column, the y-axis to be the y column, and you also have the options of choosing what kind of data you're showing. In our case, it's a number, so that's all fine. And then we're also going to color by the digit because we want to see the different digits represented on different scales. Now you'll notice that it's already done some coloring, but this is not ideal. So we can go over here to the Style tab, go to Colors, and in this color scheme option, we can pick an option we like. For instance, if you like dark 2, here's the example of how that looks with that color scheme. Of course, you can customize this significantly more. You can show that you can have other options which let you pick how the color bar is styled and all that. You can zoom out and look at the whole plot in some detail. This itself isn't interactive, but we'll see how to make it interactive in the later plot. However, the nice thing here is this gives you the Python code that you could use to generate exactly this plot. And so if you're not familiar, this is how Altair kind of plots it. This is very similar in spirit to how grammar of graphics kind of things work. But you'll see that there's a lot of options for customization, including how to have a grid, what to show in the tooltips. Here's the thing where we chose the color scheme and what type of things it is. Of course, if I can try to do a categorical, instead of quantitative, we would want to make this categorical, and that would give us the plot that we saw below, right here. So the way this chart is rendered is using the scatter function that's defined below, which is also an Altair chart, as we've seen. Importantly here, the digit is encoded as n instead of q, which if you're familiar with Altair, you'll know that that makes these discrete color labels instead of the continuous plot that we saw earlier. Interestingly, this MOUI Altair chart function makes reactive charts with Altair. So while before we saw the plot that plotted all these scatter points, if I wrap it around in this function, I can now select by dragging my cursor, clicking and dragging my cursor across this, and whatever points I've selected becomes available as a data frame. And that data frame is what we're visualizing here. So the data frame is populated in chart.value, and that is what it's populating as a table. So this allows you to create, in the same workflow, dashboards, Python scripts, and just exploratory data visualization exercises, which I find really, really cool. And all of this usually can be run on your computer with very little setup because of the way Marimo handles package management. You can let it handle installing all your packages with UV, and that runs really, really fast. And when you're done with it, you can upload it to GitHub and then put a link with marimo.app/the link of the GitHub file, and it will run it in your browser using their hosting solution, which effectively just serves the file over a server locally. So with that, I've come to the end of what I wanted to show you about this very cool new notebook format that is very exciting for me. And I'm happy to take any questions you have. Yeah, if you have a question, please unmute yourself and ask it.
Yeah, thanks for a very nice tutorial. So what is the support behind this new product? Is it a big team or who is behind this?
Yeah, so Marimo is funded by a lot of the leading data science companies. So perhaps for this, it would be I can just go back to my desktop and show you the Marimo website because that lists a lot of these things in detail. So Marimo is funded by partly it is NumFocus affiliated, so it's not somebody's pet project, but it is also funded by a lot of the teams that are responsible for things like TensorFlow and other things. So there's a lot of funding from them. Marimo itself is developed by, I think the GitHub has a better explanation of this. Yeah. So scrolling down, you will see perhaps in the FAQ. Oh yeah, that's what it is. Maybe. Well, I can't find the page right now, but there is a place here where it lists all the funding and whoever's paying for it. But the developers are former data science people, and there's a very large team behind Marimo at the moment. You'll notice that Marimo has over like 14,000 stars on GitHub, so it's really popular library. It has over 156 contributors. One of them, I think I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the Wiggly Stuff library. If you are not familiar with Vincent's work, he's worked on stuff for scikit-learn and other things. Yeah, there's a lot of very talented people working on Marimo, which is why I'm excited for this notebook. So there's a question that, so there's two questions which I'll answer. How did you get into using Marimo and what am I currently using? I saw Marimo, I'm not sure how I came across it, but I think I ran into it at maybe like a PyCon talk that I was watching. And I thought it was really cool that there was now a reactive notebook for Python because Marimo sort of was inspired uh, as the latest thing by Pluto notebooks, which are Julia notebooks. And I'd always wanted sort of Julia's Pluto kind of reactivity in Python. So I was very happy to see when Marimo started being developed very actively. What do I use it for? I use it for basically all my research, compute, like simulation stuff. So even though today I've only shown you writing code in notebooks, you can write your Python functions and whatever in scripts and then import them into your notebooks as you would regularly. So all my research simulation workflows I do in Marimo now as opposed to Jupyter. There is another question which says, is there an advantage to using Jupyter Lab as opposed to Marimo? Yeah, I think so. Personally, there are reasons to use Jupyter where Marimo wouldn't work, and part of it is that Jupyter has spent a lot more time being around and being developed, and so a lot of ecosystems are very heavily integrated into Jupyter. So, for instance, some of these widgets that I showed you run in Marimo, but not in Jupyter. However, there's this library called AnyWidget, which is sort of the next generation of IPy widgets, which is supposed to be cross-platform and runs on anything, and that's kind of what this Wiggly Stuff widgets are. So if you have some kind of workflow that requires a Jupyter notebook specifically for rich display, for example, if you're doing some kind of VTK data visualization, I know that PyVista, the library, has extensive Jupyter integration for their visualization, but so far that does not natively work on Marimo. So there are those kind of reasons which exist. Additionally, I know a lot of research groups have well-tested and verified workflows that they do in terms of Jupyter notebooks. For example, people who do experiments on superconducting qubits have a set of like template Jupyter notebooks where they have sequentially defined experiments that they will run, and they want to run that repeatedly. So things like that might be hard to switch over to Marimo for in the sense that it will take an amount of effort. So one of the things that Marimo requires you to do is there's some coding assumptions that Marimo makes in that when it creates the directed acyclic graph of dependencies between cells, it requires that you do not define a variable somewhere and update it in a different cell, because then it cannot keep track of which order to run the various cells in. So for Marimo to work, you need your cells to be idempotent, meaning that if you run it again, it'll produce the exact same result. And you will not, so you cannot have cycles in your code, you cannot do variable updates, things like that. There's a guide on the documentation to for Jupyter users, which I encourage you to look at to see the differences from Jupyter. There's another question in the chat asking if GPUs are supported. Indeed, they are. Marimo is just runtime, so it does not run anything on the GPU, but you can run GPU code inside of Marimo. So you can do machine learning stuff in Marimo. You can run CuPy and Numba stuff in Marimo, and it will just run the Python cells according to the order of dependencies. Also, we didn't necessarily see this during the stream because I don't have a GPU connected to my computer, but in the bottom right of the Marimo window, there's a little widget that monitors your resources. So there's a CPU monitor, a memory monitor, and if your system has a GPU, there's also a GPU, I believe it's GPU memory monitor that will let you see the state of your currently running GPUs. So in the interest of the report, yeah, I'm not sure if the recording. Yeah, so in the interest of the recording, I'm going to stop the recording.